Hello, I'd like to welcome you all to the 5th Annual Libby Lecture in Natural Resource Policy. Before we begin, we have some words from Liz Erickson from the University of Maine Foundation. Welcome, Liz.
Hello, and welcome to the 2023 Libby Lecture in Natural Resource Policy and to the Buchanan Alumni House. Buchanan Alumni House is the home of the University of Maine Alumni Association and the University of Maine Foundation. My name is Liz Erickson, as Don mentioned, and I'm a Senior Director of Philanthropy here at the UMaine Foundation. I'd like to welcome you today for this lecture and to thank Lois and Larry Libby, who are joining us virtually for making this presentation possible through their generosity. The first Libby Lecture took place in 2017, and today we gather for the 5th Annual Libby Lecture. And now I'd like to introduce Emily Haddad, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences.
Thank you, Liz. And thanks to all of you for attending this year's Libby Lecture in Natural Resource Policy. The Libby Lecture reflects a collaboration between the natural and social sciences, as well as between the Colleges of Liberal Arts and Sciences and Earth, Life, and Health Sciences, formerly known as Natural Sciences, Forestry, and Agriculture. This event embodies UMaine's values as a land, sea, and space grant institution that is charged with advancing research for the benefit of Maine's communities. As part of this mission, the University of Maine has become a national leader in engaged interdisciplinary research focused on natural resource conservation and policy. As such, UMaine is a fitting home for an event that explores the human, social, and political dimensions of how environmental resources are used and conserved. The brief biographies of Lois Libby and Larry Libby in your program make clear the lifelong commitments that led them to support this annual lecture. Lois Libby earned degrees in psychology, that one's from UMaine, and in social work. Her professional interests included rural poverty and employment, civil rights, and labor policy, among other areas. Beginning with a degree in agricultural science from UMaine, Larry Libby enjoyed a distinguished career in resource economics and public policy. He retired from The Ohio State University in 2006, having held an endowed chair in rural-urban policy. Both Lois and Larry embody commitment to the ways that research-driven public policy and action can strengthen and enrich society. We are immensely grateful to them for establishing the fund that supports this annual lecture. And we're honored that they're able to join us virtually today, although we miss them in person. And I say that to you directly, Lois and Larry, we miss you. Thank you for everything that you've done to make this possible. Before today's speaker, Dr. Eric Roy, is introduced, I will take a moment to recognize the members of the Libby Lecture Committee. They are Alan Adams from the CLAS Dean's Office, Don Beath, Department of Philosophy, Christine Vital, Department of Anthropology, Liz Erickson, whom you just met, from the UMaine Foundation, Christy Hamilton, also from the Foundation, and Amber Roth from the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Conservation Biology. Thanks to all of you. And now the Libby Lecture Committee Chair, Don Beath, will introduce our speaker. Don?
Thank you, Dean Haddad. I'm Don Beath, Chair for the Planning Libby Lecture Committee for 2023, the 5th Annual Libby Lecture. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Eric Roy this afternoon, but before I do, I want to remind our in-person attendees that there will be a reception after in Leadership Hall, so please feel free to grab some food, a beverage, and join us for some more discussion. At 2 o'clock, we'll continue our discussion informally in the music parlor with Dr. Roy, so if you'd like to join for a quieter chat after, feel free to stick around. Before beginning, I want to express appreciation to the student ushers here today, to the Libbys, to the colleges and deans, and to the University of Maine Foundation. I'd like to personally thank this year's Libby Lecture Planning Committee members, especially Christine Beidel, Amber Roth, the generous efforts of Liz Erickson and Christy Hamilton as our hosts at the UMaine Foundation and organizers of our reception, and especially Alan Adams, who was instrumental in recruiting our speaker, spreading word, and shaping a meaningful Libby Lecture. I'm so excited today to introduce our own Dr. Eric Roy, a UMaine Ph.D. graduate in oceanography in 2009. Eric also holds a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Colby College. At UMaine, he worked with professors Mark Wells and Carl Tripp, and here he developed startups in R&D, product development, and commercial growth, including a UMaine spin-out company from the Tripp Lab called Oranospectral Solutions. Next, Dr. Roy joined a startup for technology used by first responders and emergency personnel called Allergent Technologies, or acquired by Allergent Technologies. Dr. Roy is the founder of Hydroviv, a water filtration company that will analyze a customer's specific needs and tailor custom filters for them. After reading about the filters, I've added it to my 2023 holiday most wanted list, especially because I learned they're capable of filtering PFAS. Eric appeared on the ABC show Shark Tank and ultimately sold Hydroviv to global water innovation company Culligan, though he remains as chief scientist. I could go on, but I won't. Dr. Roy embodies innovation in the nexus between sustainability research, engaged science, and environmental justice that's at the heart of this lecture series and much of the research we do here at UMaine. We're so excited to have him here today for this year's Libby Lecture entitled, We Understand the Problem, Now What? The opportunity for scientists to pursue advocacy and entrepreneurship. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Roy.
All right, we're pulling a quick audible with a microphone here because apparently the audio is not coming through. Are we live with the handheld? Testing audio, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As I said earlier, I only know my numbers up to 5, so. So I guess kind of before we get started, while we're fixing this, I just do want to kind of mention that we had this really incredible conversation with the Libbies ahead of this lecture. I wish they would have recorded all of their dinner conversations with Larry coming from natural resource and also just kind of, Lois's background in social work, and, you hear about what their kids have gone off to do, and they're doing amazing things in science and science communications. We talked about, I bet those are some of the most interesting dinner conversations that have been around. How are we looking on audio? We still not quite up? All right. I think we're still working on the audio link here. But anyway, it's really pretty special before we get into this talk. While I just have a little bit more time here for the people in the room, it's pretty remarkable to kind of come back to the place where you did your PhD and also see some of the people that were so instrumental in your development. I mean, Susan Brawley, has come out of retirement to come join here. Susan was the head of a GK-12 fellowship program that I was a part of, where I worked in a lot of the local public schools, and that was hugely impactful on my professional career here. Also fortunate enough to have Dr. Carl Tripp, who's one of my PhD advisors from chemistry. And when he, shows up with his grad students, that's a pretty special thing. And also Luc Doucette, who was my first boss at the first company I worked for. That was that university spin-out that we were talking about, Oranospectral Solutions. So it's always pretty amazing to kind of see people that had a major impact on you when you come back and talk. Still working on audio. Does anyone have questions? I mean, you've already seen my plan. You've already seen the plan for today. We can just jump right to the Q&A. No, I'm not that funny. That's the whole thing, right? Does anyone know jokes?
Can you sing and dance?
I can do neither of those things, and you know that.
I know.
Susan.
How much chemistry do you still do as opposed to management activities?
I would say the chemistry that I do is more communicating science, mostly to elected officials and kind of those types of folks and journalists. I am not in the lab anymore. It's something that I enjoyed my time when I was in the lab, but learned that that's not where I kind of wanted to spend my time. So doing a lot of communication of science, a lot of advocacy work, and serving as an advisory role to our science team at Culligan. Culligan has our parent company has an incredible science team. So I'm always supporting them and challenging them, but then they have to figure it out. So that's how it works now. Yeah.
So for the students in the room,
Yep.
and if you're going to talk about this in your talk, you can back off.
Okay.
I'll come up with another question. What would you suggest that they do while they're students to keep open the option of an entrepreneurial career?
Yeah, so we'll talk about that later, but the number one thing is understand that, like, when you're on campus, it's the last really convenient place that you're going to meet people that have dedicated focus in certain areas. So if you're in science and you want to go into science communications, talk to the journalism students. Talk to the artists. Those are the people that are communicators. Have them challenge you on those things, and that's a big thing that I'm a major advocate for. So yeah, we'll talk more about that and kind of the opportunities. And I think, one of the things we'll talk about is how there's a lot of knowledge on campuses like this that don't make it to the public, and we need people to kind of shepherd that information to the public. And it really should be people with a science background, for sure. So we're still working on it. Yeah.
How much pushback have you gotten from science colleagues when you call yourself an advocate?
A lot.
And how do you respond to them?
It's hard to respond to it. Like one of the things where I sit now, I'm no longer an impartial party, right? I'm an executive at a company. So when I say something, there's always kind of the underlying implication that I'm saying it for commercial purposes. It's not generally the case, but it's something that you do definitely need to overcome. So, if you just keep saying the truth over and over and over again, like you start saying, okay, tell me exactly where I was wrong, and they can't. I've actually run into a couple problems with some faculty at other schools that, they're mad dogging my customer support team on certain things. They're administering chemistry tests to my customer support team because apparently that's a thing, I guess. But I thought faculty were really busy, but apparently there are some that are not because they're, challenging, my customer support team on certain things. But, for the most part, like once you actually get them in the room and you start talking to them and like they start to understand that you're not just some hack. So, I think that's one of the unfair advantages that faculty at institutions like this have is like leverage the fact that you're part of like an academic institution, right? And I think that's a huge thing.
Can I follow that up?
Please.
How long did it take for you to realize that you were an advocate?
I don't know the answer to that. So, at some point it just kind of happens. I would say like I was asked to testify on Capitol Hill as an expert witness, so I guess that was kind of one of those like hard lines in the ground on that. So,
And now,
are we live?
annual Libby lecture.
All right, great. So, thank you for. Or in which microphone are we live through? Handheld or okay? So we're live through handheld. Cool. So again, just wanted to give thanks to the Libby family here. We had an incredible talk before this, and just wonderful people, passionate, and they are just so deeply grateful for the people that put this seminar on, as well as the people that come to it. So what we'll talk about today is this idea of understanding the problem and now what. And it's a little bit of an interesting talk because I'm coming here as a scientist, but this is not an impartial talk. This is a legit call to action. I want more scientists to start companies, and I want more scientists to become advocates for scientific issues. That's something that I'm deeply, deeply passionate about, and I think we need more of. And one of the things that I like to call out before this is not negative on research. It's quite the opposite. Like the time I spent in academia was some of the most impactful time in my life. But one of the things I wish I would have known while I was in grad school was the other career opportunities. And this isn't a career talk, but I do these types of things because I want the grad students to kind of understand that there are other opportunities out there outside the lab. So if you hate research, don't start a career in research, start a career in something you actually enjoy doing. So with that, plan for today is I want to talk a little bit about the research to product ecosystem. One of the things that I did in preparation for this talk is talk to some of the people that I went to grad school with that are now faculty and said, what do you wish you knew? And it was universally the business of doing science. So I'll talk a little bit about that as a backdrop because it's important because research costs money. So we need to know about that. The second thing that we'll go into is kind of two advantages that entrepreneurial scientists have in the current research ecosystem. There are good parts of the ecosystem. There are not so great parts of the ecosystem. Entrepreneurial scientists have what we call in the startup world an unfair advantage in that ecosystem, though. And then I also want to talk a little bit, because so much of what I do now focuses on advocacy, I want to make sure that I do give a lot about how this actually plays out in the non-commercial space. How do you get more people on board? And when we're talking about solving the major problems that we face right now, I think if there's one thing we've learned in the past 10 years is the political climate is so divisive that you're not just going to be able to legislate our way to things without getting buy-in from the public. That buy-in on the scientific issues is going to need to come from somewhere. I would argue it should probably come from the scientific community that actually understands the problems. And then, of course, because my background is in startups, that will be the backdrop for this lecture. So let's start about the research to product ecosystem. First thing I'll kind of talk about is what does money look like? Is it going up or down? So this graph is from National Science Foundation, and this is showing, the blue trace is showing total R&D dollars. The orange trace is showing R&D dollars that come from corporate side. You see that's going up. And then the green, unfortunately, is the federally funded research dollars. And you're seeing a trend down. Good thing, overall it's going up. One of the surprising things that I think a lot of faculty, when they're starting out their careers, don't really understand is it's going up in the private sector. And that's not to say that you don't go after government grants and things like that, but understanding that there are other pots of money out there is actually really, really important if you want to get your research funded. So this is the source of funding. The next thing that I want to show is a graph showing the year-over-year change in who does the research. So when we're talking about performers, where we talked about where the money came from, largely coming from government or largely coming from business, and then you start asking the question, who's doing the research? Again, this is NSF numbers. And what you find is in all performers, it's all year over year, like gangbusters, it's great. But then you bump over one and you see that all of that growth is actually among businesses. Businesses are doing the bulk of research right now. Everywhere else, so the federal intramurals, so this is the agency work, so if EPA funds research done by EPA scientists, it goes there. FFRDCs is an acronym, it's like the national labs. That's kind of up, but very little. Higher education, universities, and nonprofits are going up, but not nearly at the growth that the business is going. This is something that a lot of people that I talk to, they don't know this. So I like to just kind of show this, really just kind of show where there's a lot of opportunity. Next thing I want to talk about is that research to product landscape. And this is kind of like the science version of, for those of you who are old enough to know, like the Schoolhouse Rock, like how a bill becomes a law. This is kind of like the technology and innovation version of it. And when you start on the left-hand side, what you have is basic research. And those of you who work in a university know this is oftentimes curiosity-driven, no real kind of short-term commercial impact, things like that. The next thing over towards the mature side is the applied research, and that's research that's, of course, done with a goal in mind. That's making things that are a bit more commercial, potentially, and things like that. Next step over is product development, and this is kind of where these applied research ideas start to get commercialized into things when they become commercial goods, where everything in this room was made by something, and they all have science teams. I like to call this out, and I also, just to help orient some of the students in the room, when you start asking who does this work, most of the universities are working on basic and applied research. Companies actually spend quite a bit of money and they do quite a bit of basic research, applied research, product development, and commercial products. So there are opportunities in both the private sector and in academia that we like to talk about. One of the other things when I'm help orient like students, grad students in particular, is understanding what's done at the different stages of research. If you're looking at basic research and applied research, kind of the work product that's produced there, it's all knowledge-based, right? So it's papers, academic presentations. It's about sharing these discoveries with folks. Kind of move over into the applied research and product development side of things, you start to get into the patents and the prototypes, and commercially available products obviously come out the other end. I do like to lay that out because if people don't like writing papers or they hate presenting work, there are other opportunities as you shift more to the commercial side. And I'm going to sound like a broken record saying that over and over, but I do like to call it out because I didn't really know about it when I was a student. We already talked a little bit about money, but I like to show this graph to show kind of where the money comes from for each of these pillars of research. Basic research and applied research, that's all grant money. That can come from internal corporate investment. That can also come from federally funded research as well. And then once you start getting more commercial, you start talking about commercial products. That's money that's coming in from corporations. And when you look at this, like from the 30,000-foot view, you might ask the question, like, what's wrong here? We have grants that cover early stage stuff. We have corporate investment that kind of covers the long-term stuff. What's the problem here? And it's not necessarily a problem, it's more of just an observation of what actually happens in practice. And what I mean by that is people that do basic research oftentimes stay in basic research. That's how universities are set up. If you set up a lab and you're doing discovery-based research, it doesn't make sense to retool your lab because you've found something that you can then apply. It makes sense for you to keep creating knowledge, and that's what ends up happening. Same thing with applied research, and then once you start getting into the corporate world, there's more kind of going between product development and commercial products because that's how companies make money. Again, this isn't a bad thing. It's an observation of what actually happens, but it also presents a real opportunity for entrepreneurial scientists. Going from that applied research into the corporate investment world, that is a place where I honestly believe that entrepreneurial-minded scientists can really bridge that gap. In the DoD world and Department of Defense world, this is called, that kind of valley is called the Valley of Death. So what they do is they take technology to a certain point and it just never becomes a thing. It gets put on a shelf. That's kind of what's known in the government procurement world as the Valley of Death. Entrepreneurial scientists can fill that gap for defense, HHS, all these places where you're doing university research and then you want to commercialize it. So what we'll talk about is kind of this, advantage number one. It's bridging silos, these silos that we already talked about, and doing it quickly and cheaply. Because if you're raising money, you want to be able to get to a commercial product as quickly as humanly possible, or you run out of money and you go to zero. So advantage number one is just, how do you go from applied research to product development quickly? I think that a smart, scientifically minded person is better positioned to do this than really any other individual kind of on the planet. So the example that I'll give is with this most recent company that we're talking about, Hydroviv, which was started, it really got off the ground as a result of the Flint lead crisis. Okay, it started as kind of this entrepreneurial, charitable project based on what happened in Flint. And I like to talk about this when I'm talking about speed to making a prototype, because what actually took place was blisteringly fast. So the 30-second version of kind of the Flint lead crisis, I know probably most people in this room understand this, but for those who don't, basically in April 2014, the city of Flint decided to change their water supply. They went from the Detroit water supply to the Flint River, and that was something that was celebrated by all their politicians because they were saving a little bit of money and becoming autonomous. But what ended up happening is roughly a year after they made that switch, you're starting to see lead levels in Flint come up very, very high. 400 parts per billion is screamingly high. So that started happening. That started hitting some of the local press in kind of spring 2015. And as a scientist, I knew that one of the lead crises that did happen, it got less press, was in Washington, D.C. in the mid-2000s. Same type of thing happened. They changed the source water. It went from non-corrosive to corrosive, and that started pulling the lead out of pipes. And when you talk to people that were in Washington, D.C., you start to understand what was actually happening there. And as a scientist, kind of the oh no moment that I experienced was, if you're looking at rated gallon capacities for most of the water filters that are out on the market, you're seeing this, but understanding that those capacities were based on lead levels that are like 100 or 150 parts per billion, and what we talked about was over 400 parts per billion. And then there's also other very popular products that just don't filter lead at all. So that was a problem. So when you start kind of looking at this as a scientist, and you're like, your oh no moment is when you start looking at like the lead levels found in Flint, you find that the rated capacities, you got to throw them out the window. And these types of things are things that the public didn't really understand. In fact, one of the things that was really commonly taking place in Flint was if you had someone with a water filter in Flint, a lot of people would then go to that individual's house to fill up jugs of water because they didn't understand that there was a lower capacity for Flint and that the filters were quickly getting exhausted. So this was kind of the oh no moment for me as someone who saw this happen in Washington, D.C. from afar. I wasn't involved in it. But just kind of understanding what was likely going to happen. So in June 2015, I started Hydroviv on paper. And basically, it was with this idea that we wanted to create filters, this is getting it off the ground, where we wanted to make sure that the water filter actually worked for Flint's lead levels. So we need to maximize, we need to improve the lead capacity. We need the flow rate to be really, really high so people would actually use it. We wanted it to connect to existing faucets so you didn't, so it was a very low barrier to entry for people. And so they could use the existing filters that they were kind of talking about in parallel with what we were going to make. And then we also wanted to make it manufacturable. As a scientist, I kind of looked at this and I'm like, this is actually something I have a pretty good idea how to do. I don't know exactly how to do it, but a quick research and development cycle could actually kind of help us go from applied research to product development. And basically, we started making these things that were designed to handle 5 times more lead than the previous generation of water filters. That was pretty cool. And we did this really, really, really fast. Like, the first filters that were donated were just a couple months after Hydroviv was formed. And this picture is one of the first filters that was actually sent to a daycare in Flint. And, you look at that and you're like, okay, now that I kind of seen more consumer products, R&D cycles, you start to really understand how fast that actually took place. It wasn't pretty, but the goal wasn't to make a commercial product. The goal was to get a water filter out the door that would work. And we were able to do that very quickly. Shortly after that, I would say Flint started getting more attention and things like that. So this project, wasn't something that I continued with. This was a side project for me. I was working a full-time job this entire time. So kind of wound it down a little bit. But one of the things that I was doing was I was walking around Washington, D.C., selling these filters door to door, and the idea was kind of the Tom's Shoe model, where if you bought a filter for your home, that would give us the money to then donate one to the folks in Flint. And one of the things that you learn when you're walking around Washington, D.C. neighborhoods is no one's actually from Washington, D.C. They're from somewhere else. So when you're talking to people like, oh, well, that's cool, but could you make one for Chicago that's optimized for Chicago's water? Yeah, I could do that. You can kind of think about that. Could you make one that's optimized for Seattle? And you start over and over again, you're like, oh, okay, there might actually be something here. Like, these custom filters are not something that exist. And if people want it, why can't we do that? So that was kind of something that was the next step. And after hearing about it, one of the things that you do in the startup world is you try to see if that message of the product that you want to build is something that's resonating with people. So I joined a pitch competition in Washington, D.C. It was a TechCrunch thing, got up on stage in front of 1,000 people that had no idea who I was, pitched the idea of custom water filters. I'm holding a phone because I don't know why I was doing it in that photo, but there's no phone on the water filter, but it was there. That ended up going well. It was very, very well received by the audience. And that was kind of like the oomph it took to kind of start looking at this as a commercial product. It's like, oh, some people are actually thinking this is pretty cool. So what about this idea of expanding custom filter concepts to other places? And again, this is kind of jumping, this is still building a new product. We'd only made a Flint lead filter. We need to make a custom water filter. So still bridging that applied research to product development bridge is really what we're looking at doing. This isn't a chemistry lecture, so I'm not going to go into exactly what we did, but what I will say is there's a lot of information out there about different types of what are called active filtration media. They all do different jobs. So this is technically a feasible thing that you could do if you could imagine changing the recipes of these filters according to the water that are in people's homes, you can make custom water filters. So that's what we did. Basically, once I found that EPA database is the entire country, so you can see the concentrations of these things. So the idea for Hydroviv turned into, how do you translate water quality data into custom filters that are optimized for every customer? That was the idea. That's how this is going to work. And I want to kind of take a step back and say we were successful in this, but one of the things I like to do is point out that this is what the company looked like in 2018. So I had this really high-tech water filter concept. We had really, really high-performing water filters, but I was selling these things at farmers markets in Washington, D.C. and door to door, okay? This was not a real company at the time, right? This was a nights and weekends project. But it's an example of bridging that applied research to product gap. And then what I just didn't really truly understand was, how do you then take that and bring it to the masses? Bridging that gap between applied research and product development is something that I've seen before. It makes sense. The first spin-out company I was a part of was a bunch of scientists trying to create products for industry and things like that. The second startup I was a part of, we were, again, a group of nerds that built and sold a company to Agilent, which those of you who work in labs, that's something that you see all around. We sold a device company to them. But the goal of those companies was to develop the technology that we then sold elsewhere. It wasn't to go to market. So one of the things when looking at a consumer product is, how do you actually reach the masses? And it turns out that going on national TV is how you do that. So Hydroviv launched nationwide on an entrepreneur show called Shark Tank. So those of you who don't really know what that is, you get a bunch of people, entrepreneurs, that just go on TV and air their startup pitch in front of millions of people. Goes well, goes poorly, it's going on TV, and the editors have editorial control of how it goes, right? So fortunately for me, it went very well. Launched on Shark Tank, and what I thought was going to happen here was just get a ton of sales, because if 5 million people learn about this really cool product that I really care deeply about, certainly money is just going to start coming out of events. That's not actually what happened. So if you're looking at it now, Hydroviv does more revenue per day than when we actually aired on national TV. So something changed. And again, like I kind of talked about, it was something that was intuitive to me when you're thinking about how do you bridge that applied research to product gap. But one of the things that took place during taping that I don't remember taking place in taping until I was watching it on national TV was learning about what customers actually care about. And in my Shark Tank episode, in watching it on TV, this was probably the most impactful lesson about commercialization that I learned. And it came from Mark Cuban as part of the taping. And he just kind of nonchalantly said, Eric, your product is not a water filter. Your product is trust. And like when they cut, that's me nodding like knowingly. I had no idea what he was talking about. I don't remember him talking about it. But it wasn't until I was watching this on TV where I'm like, yeah, this actually makes a ton of sense. This is how you commercialize a product. It's not about the nerdiness and the data science and the chemistry that went into this. It's about what the product does for people. Do they trust that it's going to do what it's going to do? So based off this and other things, we started completely changing the way that we market this product. And we had, a lot of commercial success with it. So we aired on Shark Tank in 2019, and fast forward about 18 months, Hydroviv was acquired by the most trusted name in water filtration. And it was because of the trust that we had built as well as the technology, and that's kind of what happened with Culligan. So that was kind of like the commercial product side of things. One of the things I really want to talk about here, because this is something that a lot of people have asked about, is advocacy. And understanding that there are a lot of parallels between innovation development and information development, okay? So if you remember this thing, when we're talking about money, and we're talking about how a lot of times basic research produces new basic research, same with applied research, and then you kind of have the corporate like mill as well. This also applies to ideas and understandings. If you take the commercial product and the actual technology out of this equation and you say, okay, universities through grants generate knowledge and companies create public awareness about issues, you can start to think about bridging that valley again, going from knowledge to activists, and then going from activists to widespread public awareness, right? That's how you get ideas in the public arena, whether those ideas are true or, as we've learned in the past decade, misinformation. I think I am a forceful advocate that scientists need to play a major role in getting the right information into the public. I don't think this is something that celebrities can do. I think we need to do this as a scientific community. So what I'll talk about here with kind of the remaining couple minutes that we have is looking at the different types of advocacy that I've been a part of, and also how those of you who are interested in this type of advocacy can move forward on it. Elected officials. Elected officials make legislation. If they don't know what to make legislation around, they don't make effective legislation. So one of the things that I've spent quite a bit of time on is working with elected officials and their staff to make sure that their understanding of the problems of water quality are understood and understood accurately, right? So in a couple years ago, I was asked to testify as an expert witness in front of a congressional subcommittee from Science, Technology, and Space, and it was actually a Hydroviv customer that was like, hey, I need you to come testify in front of this group because there was a Flint situation taking place in Newark, New Jersey. That's what was happening. Kind of the same type of thing was taking place, and they wanted to understand how governments could work with innovators, can work with the community to make sure that people's water was fixed. So I did that. That was very, very impactful for me. Understanding, kind of hearing some of the stories of folks that were undergoing these crises. It's just, these are the things that kind of make you get up in the morning and really work very hard on this. The second type of advocacy, and I know this is a little eye-rolly, I think when you're talking on a college campus, but informational content that the general public actually consumes is critical. This is something that we do at Hydroviv. The channels that we get the most traction on are YouTube and Instagram, and we have a newsletter. Just to understand kind of what kind of impact we're talking about, does anyone want to take a stab at in the past 30 days, how many people viewed purely informational content? I'm not talking about ads from Hydroviv's channels. Anyone want to take a stab at it? Trailing 30 days.
100K.
100K.
2 mil.
2.5 million. We reached 2.5 million people in the past 30 days with purely informational content. That's mind-blowing to me. 2.5 million people. And we're not talking about TikTok dances. We're not talking about like blooper videos, cat videos, or anything like that. We're talking about my mug shot on a cell phone on the back using news articles as a backdrop where we're talking about issues. How many lead pipes are there in your state? That video, as of last night, has 1.7 million views. People care about this. We just need to be communicating with them in the way that they want to get that information in the venues where they're receptive to getting that information. This is huge for us. This is something that Hydroviv actually, we dedicate entire head counts just to informational stuff, figuring out what are the topics that are out there, creating content around it, curating that content. We don't make any money on this. This is not something that we're trying to make money off of, so we leave it out of all of our marketing stuff. It's impactful, and it's something that's growing for us, and it's something that we're gaining a ton of traction on, which is really exciting, because if you look at the early activities that took place for Hydroviv, it was a lot of blog writing. So the idea that these things are now millions of views is something that's really quite remarkable to me. The second to last thing I want to talk about is supporting the press. The media does want to do a good job on this. They just don't know. They're journalists. They don't know the nitty-gritty of the science, so they're reading a lot of stuff from the AP, and they don't necessarily know what that means in context. I can give an example. On the topic of forever chemicals or PFAS, there was a time where there was all this PR coming from a lot of universities and national labs talking about, oh, we have these new technologies that are going to destroy PFAS. And I'm like, okay, I'm sitting up in my chair now and I'm looking at it. And what you find is a lot of these technologies, while great, they're still very, very much in the basic research and the applied research phase. They were for 2 chemicals out of tens of thousands of PFAS chemicals. And realistically, the experiment that was being reported in these major news outlets was done in a 5 milliliter beaker. And it was giving people the impression that the cavalry was coming. This is decades out, low probability of success. So one of the things I was doing is reaching out to all the journalists that were writing about this, not knocking the research because it's so critical that this work is done, but explaining to them the context behind it. And you actually see a lot of these articles get edited. I've also been, there was a water documentary on ABC News, kind of a 3-part documentary put out a few months ago. I actually went on background with the journalism team on this for about 6 hours, just on background, just because they wanted to make sure that the right information was getting out there. And as we kind of talked about before we had the audio thing back on, I'm not given credit in any of these things, and that's fine, because I didn't want the fact that I work for a company to get in the way of that information getting out there. So, this is something that I think people, even if you don't want to start a company, this is the easiest thing every scientist in this room can do, is call up the environmental journalists at the media outlets and say, hi, my name is whatever, I'm a professor of this, and I am here to help you and answer any questions that you have on any articles on this topic. They will call you back. They will get your text message. They'll exchange numbers with you and work with you. I'm currently working with, I'm working with journalists from all of these establishments right now on just getting water quality policy and information out there accurately. The final thing that I'll talk about today is how charity has grown at Hydroviv. Again, we talked about Hydroviv getting off the ground by me building water filters in my kitchen table and donating them to daycares. One of the things that I learned in going back through that, my product is trust. It's not a water filter, it's trust, is working with people that have a massive audience. They want to work with credible people, because if they work with someone that's not credible, they're all of a sudden, they're on the front page of newspapers. So one of the things that we did is we worked with an activist, a very prominent activist with a major following from Flint, become friends with her family, and we've worked to raise almost $1 million, and that has gone directly into procuring, building water filters and donating them to people that wouldn't be able to do it. $1 million worth of product. This is all done before the acquisition at Culligan. So this is stuff that was done, very much on a very, very small scale. But it just goes to show that, like, when you get the right people in the room, you can actually have some pretty asymmetric impacts. And I just want to leave everyone today with just a couple things. This really is a call to action. I want every scientist kind of that's listening here to understand that these types of entrepreneurial pursuits, whether they're commercial or non-commercial, it's more important than ever. If you're looking at the water quality legislation that's taking place right now, the regulatory stuff, it's moving faster on forever chemicals than anything I've ever seen before. That's entirely because of the advocacy efforts that are taking place out there. You have the federal government that's working to get these things on the enforceable contaminants list. You have the federal government working with states to get it on the state list before it can get legislated onto the EPA stuff. And that does not happen without advocacy efforts. Again, I honestly believe that because, the idea that, like, scientists are these trusted members of the community, trust is the unfair advantage that everyone has, and you don't need a massive team to actually deliver massive impact. And again, like, that's just what I want to leave people here with today. And I know we got a little bit of a late start, so I moved a little quicker, but I wanted to leave time for Q&A. So with that, I just want to give a final thank you to the Libby family for making this work. One of the fun facts is the Libby family, I did my office when I was in grad school was in Libby Hall. So it was kind of interesting to talk to the family behind the building that I spent an ungodly amount of hours in, and that was something that we got a kick out of this morning. So with that, I want to thank the committee. So much work went into this, and of course, thank everyone here for your attention. With that, I'll answer any questions you have.
So having been on both sides of the aisle now, academic and commercial, what do you see as the biggest impediments from doing exactly what you see it should be done? More scientists commercializing and getting these ideas out of the world? Yeah, so the question, just so those who are virtual can hear it, is now that I've been kind of on the academic side and on the non-academic side, on the advocacy side, what are the big hurdles that are faced? And that was actually one of the things that I asked in preparation. Like, I asked a bunch of the faculty that are kind of my age, why aren't you doing this? And they're like, well, my lab has a website. And I'm like, okay, cool, but, like, how many people are going to that website? And they're like, well, we don't know. I'm like, okay, so it's an afterthought. So how do you move forward on it? And I started challenging them on, well, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And what kept coming up over and over was, well, I'm not the world expert on this exact topic. This person would be better for it. And I'm kind of like, well, are you better than, insert person A, B, C that's, like, saying the earth is flat? So, like, I think it's this idea that the pursuit of perfection is just paralyzing. It's a lot of P's. But yeah, I think that's something that's come up over and over again. And just understanding, like, and, I was talking with some younger or early career faculty about it, and imposter syndrome is a real thing. And it's like, no, I promise you belong in this public conversation. So I think that's the biggest thing. And strangely enough, I think the grad students are way better at this than the faculty. So I have a ton of hope for kind of the new crop of scientists coming through.
So, Eric, I was struck by your final comment, or one of your final comments, that scientists are who are trusted. That scientists are trusted. And you started the talk with the divisive political environment, you know, my sense is that scientists are not actually trusted. So I'm curious about your experience there and your take on it.
No, it's a good point. So I'll just reiterate the question. I made the case that scientists are trusted, and then this was a challenge to say, well, with the politically divisive kind of language in the ecosystem that's out there, are scientists really trusted? So I guess what I'd speak to is if you look at what comes through our customer support line, you know, we're not talking about like surface potential of the filtration media that we're talking about, right? We're talking about people that are coming in with a high level of anxiety about their water quality and trying to lower their anxiety, right? Those are universal things, whichever side of the aisle that you're on. One of the things that I think we see is we just assume that, I think there's a reaction that when someone asks a really basic question, it's that, oh, they're dumb. Well, it's not that they're dumb, they just don't know. So maybe, you know, one of the things we need to be thinking about is how do you kind of step back and talk about all the historical research that has come to inform our understanding in the current day. And I think it's been my experience that when you do that, you answer all their questions politely with, you know, humility, because understand, they just don't know. They didn't read that paper from 2008. They just didn't do it. Believe it or not, they didn't read like my dissertation. So like, right? Like, you know, that was just understanding, like meeting people like where they're at and just being really helpful in answering their questions. And we've seen that tactic just delivers for us, and you just build trust. So it takes work, and you know, there are more advanced things I'd rather be talking about, but it's not where the public awareness, that's not where they're at yet. So you got to talk where the public's at. But great question. Yeah.
So there's this concept in certain areas of academia that you're a public fill in the blank. So a public sociologist, a public historian. Could you say a little bit about public science in an academic context? Like Kate is public science. She runs a Discovery Museum.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing, and also not my question. Like the faculty members that would be in your cohort who are saying, well, I'm not going to because, is there a category of public scientist that can apply in that setting?
I think so. I think it just takes people that are interested in doing that work, right? So, you know, if you have no interest in engaging with the public, do not engage with the public. It's not going to go well. Like, you're going to find it frustrating. It's not going to be informative, and you're not going to persuade anyone. But if you enjoy working with the public, whether you're faculty and you're doing it on the side, or whether that's what you get up every day doing every single day, it doesn't really matter as long as that good information is getting out there. So I think there's such a vacuum, an information vacuum on science and public awareness on this stuff, that like there's so much room for anyone, whether they're doing it off the side of their desk or, you know, this is what they dedicate their lives to. Yes?
I'd like to hear your take on how to help scientists who think they might like to do it and are too nervous about coming forward. My background is in theater, and I did it professionally, and then after I retired, I got doing it with community theater. And I had many people who said, gee, I'd love to do this, but I'm scared to death. I don't dare do it. And I helped them overcome that fear, and now they're having a marvelously good time doing it. But it took steps, and I had to be supportive of them, and then they said, oh, wow, I mean, actually, I can do this, but it doesn't happen overnight. How would you do it with scientists to give them that that support so that they could take that risk?
Yeah, so just summarizing the question, just for those who are virtual, what do you say to people who maybe don't feel confident putting themselves out there publicly to talk about science? You know, people don't remember the bad stuff. They just skip through it. I mean, that's the reality. If you look at some of my early videos, they're embarrassingly terrible. But only about 33 people saw them. So it's like, okay, 33 people, 1.7 million. Okay, like I'm feeling pretty good about that. Like I think people think that people remember things for a really long time, and especially when you're looking at the popular social media channels, it's literally just scrolling for hours on 7-second clips. No one's going to remember the bad stuff, and if they do remember it, like it's going to get forgotten really quickly. So yeah, I wish I had a better answer for it. I wish I had something more inspirational, but it's just kind of how it
But
is.
there's something that we say in theater to an actor: if you make a mistake on stage, you play past it.
Oh yeah.
If you stay with that mistake, then all the next moves are ruined.
Oh yeah.
And so, if that information could be given to somebody who said, "Oh, I really flubbed on that one," no, you just play past it and focus on the next step.
And you know, when you're shooting videos for social media, you can always it's not live theater, right? You can do take 2. And yeah, so the consequences are very low of doing poorly, and you can just delete it. So it's not that bad. Yeah, for sure.
We have a lot of graduate art students that I'm really interested in your take on that are working with science, and I'm really interested in hearing your take on the role of art as what is that role? Is it window dressing? What credibility do you give to artistic research? Because it's something that we are talking a lot about,
Mhm.
so I'd love to hear what you
So this was a question about from an art department, from an artist asking about my take on artists getting involved with this stuff. I think it's critical. I'm actually very familiar with their art. Been to several of the events on campus where your Forever Chemicals stuff was displayed, and it's something that, you know, I think where artists, you talk about unfair advantages, and artists' unfair advantage is making people feel something when they're consuming the information. And that's something that is unique to artists. So I'm a huge fan of what you're doing, where you have artists working hand in hand with scientists. Feels pretty unstoppable. You know, it's like, because it's the correct information and you're making people actually feel something.
We have to be honest that it's not always easy, though, to be on that equal playing field. And so it's something that we're really actively talking about a lot.
Yeah.
And so I'm really interested.
I think we can have a
We're
number
actively talking about
of let's continue the conversation. It's something that I'm pretty passionate about. So I think I'm in the area, you're in the area. I think we can continue the conversation for sure.
I think to add to that, you have this lovely video, image of the academic money, and then you created this little valley of death, and then you created the business. There's actually not, in art, we don't make a product. And so that funding doesn't really, you didn't include us in your conversation, although you mentioned.
It's a fair point. Yep. So that wasn't something that was included in kind of the funding side of things. Yeah, no, that's a very fair point. And I think one of the things when we're looking at this is how do we, if we're not making products, how do we do the same thing with information, right? And I think that when we're talking about this, when we're talking about knowledge and public awareness, I think the tools that we use to arrive at that public awareness, I think artists understand this better than I could ever. Different things resonate with different people. So whether it's auditory, visual, whatever it is. So when we're creating this public awareness, and you really need to, not everyone consumes information in an article. So we need to be hitting people with different types of messages and different types of arenas. So I'm fully on board with this. I wish I had any of those skills. So, yeah. Susan.
We're Americans, and so this question may not be so germane, but I'm interested in how what you have said would differ if you had been speaking to a German audience or a Japanese audience or a Chinese audience.
So the question was, how would this message change if I was speaking to audiences in Germany or Japan? Well, I suspect we will be learning this because one of the motivations of selling to an international company is international reach. So I think this is something that I will personally be learning more about in the future. I don't know the answer. I don't know how I'm going to do it on day zero, but something we're definitely going to find out because it is important. Yeah.
Germany supposedly works on a lot of small, innovative companies, right? And training workers at a younger level, I mean, integrating them into companies, am I right about that? Maybe some.
That's my understanding, yeah.
And so I just wonder how some of the graphs and things would shift, and whether, is possible to learn something from the other?
I think there's a lot to be learned there for sure. And I think one of the things that I don't really have a good grasp on is the funding ecosystem in Germany or Japan. So it's hard for me to kind of look at like, okay, where's the opportunity when I'm ignorant on the actual underlying fundamental or the financials. But yeah, I think it's something we're probably going to be finding out in the next 12 months at Hydroviv. So yeah.
A couple of audience questions.
Yeah.
First, our virtual audience.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get the Hydroviv filters built so quickly? Did you have a pre-existing patent? And then changing gears, there's an interface between sustainability entrepreneurs and government. Is the next step having scientists run for office? What do you think about that?
Okay, so question one was how did we make this happen so quickly? Was there an existing patent or anything like that? There was not. I went to a very reputable manufacturing, well, I called all of the companies that manufacture these things, and I worked with the one that would actually work with me, being like, hey, I have no money, it's not even really a company, and I need like 100 of a thing, and I still maintain that commercial relationship because they were dealing with me when we were quite a bit smaller. And basically I just went to them and said, okay, so how do we 5x the lead capacity of these cartridges? And I don't know how to make these things, but I understand what's in them. And we together with their engineers, we came up with a spec that they were able to mass produce at a very high quality, which is great. And then the second question was going from, using the graph up here, from knowledge to public awareness. How do I feel about scientists running for public office? There are entire political action committees that are focused on that. I think one is called, 314 Action, and their entire stated purpose is getting scientists and healthcare professionals to run for elected office. I'm a huge fan of it, though I would imagine it would be, knowing what I know about Congress and Capitol Hill, I think it would probably be pretty frustrating. But yeah, we need to do it. So the people that have that patience, bless them. I'm cheering for you and I'll vote for you. So yeah.